In a world where strength is measured by the weight you can carry and the distance you can run, nobody expected the quiet girl with gentle hands to become the most feared name whispered by enemy forces. They called her the Ghost, not because she was invisible, but because she appeared when death seemed certain, carrying hope on her back through hell itself. This is the story of how the weakest link in the chain became the strongest force on the battlefield, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't made of steel, it's made of heart. What happens when the person everyone underestimates becomes the only thing standing between life and death? What happens when being too soft for war becomes the exact quality that wins it? You're about to discover how one woman's refusal to leave anyone behind changed everything. Sarah Martinez had always been small. At 5 feet and barely weighing 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a military medic. When she arrived at Camp Thunder for her first deployment, the other soldiers took one look at her and immediately assumed she wouldn't last a week. The base was located in the heart of enemy territory, where temperatures soared to unbearable heights during the day and dropped to freezing at night. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky terrain that could cut through boots and sandstorms that could blind a person in seconds. It was no place for someone who looked like she belonged in a library rather than a war zone. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Standing 6 feet tall with arms like tree trunks, he had been in combat for over 8 years. When he saw Sarah struggling to carry her medical pack during the initial briefing, he shook his head and muttered to his buddy, "Great, another fragile flower we'll have to babysit. She'll probably cry the first time she hears gunfire." The other recruits laughed, but Sarah heard every word. She had been hearing similar comments her entire life. In high school, she was too small for sports. In college, professors questioned whether she had the physical strength for emergency medicine. Even during basic training, drill sergeants had pulled her aside multiple times, suggesting she might be better suited for administrative work. But Sarah had something that couldn't be measured by height or weight. She had an unbreakable determination that had been forged through years of proving people wrong. Growing up as the youngest of 5 children in a rough neighborhood, she had learned early that survival wasn't about being the biggest or strongest. It was about being smart, persistent, and never giving up when things got tough. Her childhood had been marked by challenges that would have broken many people. Her father had left when she was 7, leaving her mother to raise 5 kids on a waitress's salary. Money was always tight, and Sarah often went to school wearing clothes that were too big or too small because they couldn't afford new ones. She watched her older brothers struggle with gangs and drugs, seeing how the streets could swallow up even the toughest kids. Instead of following the same path, Sarah threw herself into her studies. She spent countless hours in the public library, reading everything she could get her hands on. Science fascinated her, particularly biology and human anatomy. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, but knew her family couldn't afford medical school. The military offered her a chance to get medical training while serving her country, so she enlisted the day after her 18th birthday. Basic training had been brutal. While other recruits complained about the early morning runs and obstacle courses, Sarah pushed herself harder than anyone else. She might not have been able to do as many push-ups as the men, but she could outlast most of them when it came to endurance. She studied medical procedures late into the night while others slept, determined to be the best medic her unit had ever seen. Now, standing in the middle of Camp Thunder, she could feel the judgment radiating from her new teammates. They saw a small woman with soft features and assumed she was weak. They didn't know about the 16-hour shifts she had worked at the hospital before enlisting, or the way she had calmly treated gunshot wounds while bullets flew overhead during training exercises. The base commander, Colonel James Harrison, was a weathered veteran who had seen countless soldiers come and go. He had learned not to judge people by their appearance, but even he had concerns about Sarah's placement. During their first meeting, he studied her carefully, noting her steady gaze and confident posture despite her small frame. "Martinez," he said, flipping through her file. "Your test scores are impressive. Top marks in trauma medicine, emergency surgery, and field treatment. But this isn't a classroom. Out here, you might need to carry a wounded soldier twice your size across dangerous terrain. Are you sure you can handle that?" Sarah looked him directly in the eye. "Sir, I didn't come here to prove I could lift heavy weights. I came here to save lives. When someone is bleeding out, they don't care how much I weigh. They care that I know how to stop the bleeding." The colonel nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. It was the same doubt she had seen countless times before. Her first few weeks at the base were exactly what she expected. The other soldiers treated her like a mascot rather than a colleague. They made jokes about her size during meals, questioned her abilities during training exercises, and generally acted like she was more of a liability than an asset. Private Tommy Chen, a young recruit fresh out of basic training, seemed particularly amused by Sarah's presence. He was barely older than she was, but his 6-foot frame made him feel superior. "Hey Martinez," he called out one afternoon during gear inspection. "Need help carrying that pack? It looks like it weighs more than you do." Sarah's medical pack was indeed heavy, loaded with supplies that could mean the difference between life and death in combat situations. It contained everything from basic bandages to sophisticated surgical instruments, along with medications and emergency equipment. The pack weighed nearly 50 pounds, almost half of her body weight. "Thanks, but I've got it," she replied calmly, shouldering the pack without visible strain. She had spent months conditioning her body to carry the weight, doing extra training sessions when no one was watching. The teasing wasn't just about her size. Some of the soldiers questioned whether a woman could handle the psychological pressure of combat medicine. They whispered that she would freeze up when faced with horrific injuries, or that she would become too emotional to make life-or-death decisions. Corporal Lisa Williams was one of the few people who didn't immediately dismiss Sarah. As one of only 3 women on the base, she understood the extra scrutiny that came with being female in a male-dominated environment. During a quiet moment in the mess hall, she approached Sarah with some friendly advice. "Don't let them get to you," Lisa said, sitting down across from her. "They did the same thing to me when I first arrived. Some of these guys think war is just about who can shoot the biggest gun or carry the heaviest load. They don't understand that there are different kinds of strength." Sarah appreciated the support, but she knew that words alone wouldn't change anyone's mind. She needed to prove herself through actions, and she was prepared to do whatever it took. The opportunity came sooner than expected. During a routine patrol simulation, one of the soldiers suffered a severe allergic reaction to something he had eaten. His throat began closing up, and within minutes he was struggling to breathe. Panic spread through the group as they realized how serious the situation was. While the other soldiers stood around arguing about what to do, Sarah immediately sprang into action. She quickly assessed the situation, recognizing the signs of anaphylactic shock. Without hesitation, she retrieved her medical kit and administered an epinephrine injection, then began monitoring his vital signs while calling for evacuation. "Everyone step back," she ordered with authority that surprised the watching soldiers. Her voice was calm and confident as she worked to stabilize the patient. She established an airway, started an IV line, and continuously monitored his condition while coordinating with the medical evacuation team. The soldier's life hung in the balance for several terrifying minutes, but Sarah's quick thinking and expert treatment made the difference. By the time the medical helicopter arrived, his condition had stabilized enough for transport to the nearest field hospital. Later that evening, word spread throughout the base about what had happened. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been among the harshest critics of Sarah's presence, approached her during dinner. His usual swagger was replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "That was good work today, Martinez," he said quietly. "You kept your head when everyone else was losing theirs."
It wasn't exactly an apology for his earlier comments, but Sarah recognized it as progress.
She nodded politely and continued eating, knowing that one incident wouldn't completely change everyone's opinions. She would need to prove herself again and again before they truly accepted her as an equal. The weeks that followed brought a gradual shift in how the other soldiers treated her. They still made occasional jokes about her size, but there was less malice behind them. More importantly, they began including her in conversations about medical procedures and combat tactics. They asked her opinion on equipment modifications and listened when she suggested improvements to their first aid protocols. Sarah used this opportunity to learn everything she could about her teammates. She studied their personalities, their strengths and weaknesses, their fears and motivations. She knew that effective combat medicine wasn't just about technical knowledge, it was about understanding the people she might need to treat under the worst possible circumstances. Private Chen, who had initially mocked her, gradually became one of her most reliable allies. She discovered that his jokes had been a way of hiding his own insecurities about being young and inexperienced. Sergeant Rodriguez, despite his gruff exterior, was deeply committed to bringing all his soldiers home safely. Colonel Harrison, she learned, had lost several medics in previous deployments and was genuinely concerned about her welfare. As her deployment continued, Sarah began to understand the rhythms of military life. She learned to sleep through artillery practice, to eat quickly during brief meal breaks, and to maintain her equipment in the harsh desert environment. More importantly, she learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when tensions were rising and conflict was imminent. The base received regular intelligence reports about enemy activity in the surrounding area. Sarah paid careful attention to these briefings, understanding that the information could be crucial if they came under attack. She studied maps of the local terrain, identifying potential evacuation routes and defensive positions. She also worked with the communications team to ensure that medical evacuation procedures were clearly understood by everyone. Despite the gradual improvement in her relationships with her teammates, Sarah knew that the real test was yet to come. Training exercises and medical emergencies were one thing, but actual combat would be something entirely different. She spent her free time reviewing trauma protocols, practicing surgical procedures, and strengthening her physical conditioning. Late at night, when the base was quiet, except for the sound of sentries walking their posts, Sarah would often think about her family back home. Her mother had been proud but worried when she deployed, making her promise to be careful and come home safely. Her brothers, who had initially questioned her decision to join the military, had gradually come to respect her choice. They sent letters describing their own struggles and achievements, and she drew strength from their support. The desert nights were incredibly beautiful, with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. During these peaceful moments, Sarah would reflect on how far she had come from that scared little girl in the rough neighborhood. She had found her purpose in life, using her skills and knowledge to protect and heal others, even in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. But she also knew that her greatest challenges lay ahead. The enemy was out there, planning and preparing for attacks that could come at any moment. When that time came, all the training in the world might not be enough. She would need to rely on every ounce of courage, skill, and determination she possessed. The other soldiers had finally begun to see her as more than just the fragile medic, but Sarah understood that respect earned in peacetime could quickly disappear under the pressure of actual combat. She was determined to prove that her small stature and gentle appearance masked a warrior's heart and an unshakable commitment to saving lives. As she looked up at the star-filled sky, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to her teammates. No matter what challenges awaited them, no matter how dangerous the situation became, she would never abandon her duty. She would be there when they needed her most, ready to risk everything to bring them home alive. The transformation from underestimated recruit to respected team member was just the beginning of Sarah's journey. The real test of her character and capabilities was approaching, and soon everyone would discover what the small medic was truly capable of when lives hung in the balance. The attack came at dawn, just as intelligence had warned it might. Sarah was conducting her morning equipment check when the first explosion shook the ground beneath her feet. The enemy had waited for the changing of the guard, timing their assault perfectly when the base was at its most vulnerable. Within seconds, the peaceful morning erupted into chaos. Mortar rounds began falling around the perimeter, sending clouds of dust and debris into the air. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed across the compound as enemy forces launched a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Sarah felt her heart racing, but her training kicked in immediately. "Medical! We need medical!" The call came from the eastern defensive position, where a mortar round had landed dangerously close to one of the guard towers. Sarah grabbed her medical pack and sprinted toward the sound. Keeping low as bullets whistled overhead, she found Private Chen pinned under a section of collapsed concrete barrier, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood was seeping through his uniform, and his face was pale with shock and pain. Two other soldiers were trying to lift the debris, but it was too heavy for them to move safely. "Chen, stay with me," Sarah commanded, dropping to her knees beside him. She quickly assessed his injuries while bullets continued to fly around them. His leg was definitely broken, and she could see signs of internal bleeding. The concrete had to be removed carefully, or it could cause even more damage. "Martinez, we need to get out of here," Sergeant Rodriguez shouted from behind a nearby wall. "This position is too exposed." "Not without Chen," she replied firmly, pulling out her medical supplies. She had trained for exactly this scenario, but the reality was more intense than any simulation could replicate. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and the smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the air. Working with practiced efficiency, Sarah established an IV line to combat Chen's blood loss while directing the other soldiers in properly lifting the concrete barrier. Once they had freed him, she quickly stabilized his broken leg and began preparing him for transport. But as she worked, the situation around them continued to deteriorate. The enemy had broken through the perimeter in 2 locations, and friendly forces were falling back toward the main compound. Communication with headquarters was sporadic due to damaged radio equipment, and several key defensive positions had been overrun. The base was in serious danger of being completely surrounded. "Medical team to the command post, immediately!" The order came through her radio as she was finishing with Chen's treatment. Colonel Harrison's voice was strained but controlled, indicating that the situation was becoming critical. Sarah looked around at the chaos surrounding her. Chen needed immediate evacuation to a proper medical facility, but the helicopter landing zone was under enemy fire. She had to make a choice between staying with her patient and responding to what sounded like an emergency at the command post. "Rodriguez, get Chen to the aid station and keep pressure on that wound," she ordered, already moving toward her next assignment. "If his condition deteriorates, radio me immediately." The command post was located in the center of the base, supposedly the most secure location available. But when Sarah arrived, she found it partially destroyed by a direct mortar hit. Colonel Harrison was conscious but seriously wounded, with shrapnel embedded in his chest and arm. 2 other officers were unconscious, and the communications equipment was completely destroyed. "Martinez, thank God," Harrison gasped as she approached. "I've got 3 men down, and we've lost contact with the outside. We need to establish a casualty collection point and coordinate medical evacuation, but I can't move with this chest wound." Sarah immediately began triaging the wounded officers, while her mind raced through the tactical situation. With communications down and the command structure compromised, someone needed to take charge of the medical response. The base's senior medic had been killed in the initial attack, leaving her as the only qualified medical officer still operational. "Sir, I need to stabilize you and get you evacuated," she said while working on Harrison's wounds. "But first, I need to know the status of our defensive positions and casualty reports from the other units." As she spoke, another explosion rocked the building, causing dust and debris to rain down from the damaged ceiling. The enemy was systematically destroying their defensive capabilities, and time was running out. Sarah realized that conventional medical evacuation procedures wouldn't work in this situation. She needed to develop a new plan that could save lives under impossible circumstances. "The eastern and northern positions have been overrun," Harrison reported through gritted teeth. "We have casualties scattered across the compound, and the landing zone is under constant fire. The enemy is trying to prevent any evacuation attempts." Sarah's mind immediately began calculating distances and obstacles. The main helicopter landing zone was indeed compromised, but there was a secondary site about 2 kilometers away that might still be accessible. The problem was getting wounded soldiers across that distance while under enemy fire. "Colonel, I need authorization to establish a new evacuation protocol," she said, continuing to work on his wounds. "I can get our people to the alternate landing zone, but it's going to require some unconventional methods." Harrison studied her face carefully. Despite his pain, he could see the determination in her eyes and the confidence in her voice. "What do you need?" Over the next few minutes, Sarah outlined her plan while treating the wounded officers. It was dangerous and would require incredible physical endurance, but it was their best hope of saving lives. Harrison listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about logistics and timing. "It's risky," he admitted when she finished explaining. "You'll be exposed to enemy fire for extended periods, and you'll be carrying wounded soldiers across difficult terrain. Are you sure you can handle the physical demands?" Sarah looked him directly in the eye, the same way she had during their first meeting months ago. "Sir, I didn't come here to play it safe." "I came here to save lives. This is what I trained for." Harrison nodded slowly, then reached for his radio. "All units, this is command. Medical evacuation procedures have changed. Report to Martinez for new instructions. She has full authority over casualty collection and transport." As word spread through the base, Sarah began organizing her rescue operation. She would need to move quickly and efficiently, taking advantage of brief lulls in the fighting to transport wounded soldiers to safety. The plan required her to make multiple trips across dangerous terrain, but it was the only way to reach everyone who needed help. The first casualty she encountered was Sergeant Williams, who had been hit by shrapnel while defending the southern gate. Her injuries were serious but not immediately life-threatening, making her an ideal candidate for the long journey to the alternate landing zone. Sarah quickly stabilized her wounds and prepared her for transport. "Martinez, you can't carry me that far," Williams protested weakly. "I'm too heavy, and you'll be exposed to enemy fire the whole way." "Let me worry about that," Sarah replied, adjusting her equipment for maximum efficiency. She had spent months preparing for exactly this type of scenario, strengthening her body and studying techniques for moving wounded soldiers across difficult terrain. The journey began during a brief lull in the fighting, when enemy forces were apparently regrouping for another assault. Sarah carefully lifted Williams onto her back, using a specialized carry technique that distributed the weight evenly across her frame. Despite Williams being nearly twice her size, Sarah had trained extensively with weighted packs that prepared her for this moment. The route to the alternate landing zone led through a series of rocky outcroppings and dried creek beds that provided some cover from enemy observation, but it also meant navigating treacherous terrain while carrying a wounded soldier, requiring incredible balance and endurance. As they moved through the first section of the route, Sarah could hear gunfire resuming behind them. The enemy had apparently discovered that casualties were being evacuated and was trying to prevent the operation. Radio chatter indicated that friendly forces were fighting desperately to buy time for the medical evacuation. "Contact left!" Williams suddenly whispered, pointing toward a ridge about 300 meters away. Enemy soldiers had spotted them and were moving to intercept their route. Without hesitation, Sarah changed direction, using a deeper creek bed that would provide better concealment. The detour added significant distance to their journey, but it was necessary to avoid enemy contact. As she navigated the rocky terrain, she could feel Williams growing heavier with each step, but her determination never wavered. The sound of approaching helicopters provided welcome relief as they neared the landing zone. Medical evacuation aircraft were attempting to reach the area, but enemy fire was forcing them to circle at a safe distance. Sarah needed to get Williams to the landing zone and establish security before the aircraft could safely approach. "Almost there," she reassured Williams, whose condition was slowly deteriorating despite her medical treatment. "Just hold on a little longer." The final approach to the landing zone required crossing an open area with no cover from enemy observation. Sarah studied the terrain carefully, timing their movement to coincide with friendly artillery fire that would distract enemy attention. It was a calculated risk, but their only option for reaching safety. As they broke cover and sprinted across the open ground, enemy fire immediately erupted around them. Bullets kicked up dust clouds near their feet, and Sarah could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds, but she maintained her pace, focusing on reaching the landing zone while protecting her wounded teammate. They reached the relative safety of the landing zone just as the medical helicopter began its approach. Sarah quickly established a secure perimeter and signaled the aircraft with her emergency beacon. Within minutes, Williams was safely aboard the helicopter and on her way to advanced medical care. But Sarah's work was far from finished. Back at the base, more wounded soldiers were waiting for evacuation, and the tactical situation was continuing to deteriorate. She had proven that her evacuation plan could work, but now she needed to implement it on a larger scale. The return journey to the base was even more dangerous than the outbound trip. Enemy forces had identified her route and were actively patrolling the area, trying to prevent further evacuations. Sarah had to use every bit of cover available, moving carefully from one concealed position to another. When she finally reached the base perimeter, she found that the situation had grown more desperate. Additional casualties had accumulated, and enemy forces were preparing for what appeared to be a final assault. The defenders were running low on ammunition and medical supplies, and morale was beginning to crack under the pressure. "Martinez," Sergeant Rodriguez called out as she approached the aid station. "We've got 5 more casualties, including Chen. His condition is getting worse, and we can't reach the main landing zone." Sarah quickly assessed the new casualties while her mind calculated the logistics of multiple evacuation trips. Each journey to the alternate landing zone took nearly an hour, and she was already feeling the effects of physical exhaustion. But she also knew that these soldiers were counting on her to get them to safety. "Rodriguez, I need you to help me organize this," she said, taking charge of the situation. "We're going to move casualties in order of medical priority, and we need to establish a relay system to speed up the process." Over the next several hours, Sarah implemented the most challenging rescue operation of her career. She made trip after trip across the dangerous terrain, carrying wounded soldiers to safety while enemy forces tried to stop her. Each journey required incredible physical and mental endurance, but she refused to give up. Private Chen was among the most seriously wounded, requiring immediate surgery that could only be provided at a major medical facility. Sarah carefully prepared him for transport, knowing that his survival depended on reaching advanced medical care within the next few hours. As she lifted Chen onto her back, for what would be her most difficult evacuation yet, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had gone from being the soldier everyone doubted to becoming their only hope for survival. The transformation was complete, but the greatest test of her abilities was still ahead. The enemy's final assault began just as Sarah was preparing to evacuate Private Chen and 2 other critically wounded soldiers. Intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces had surrounded the base and were moving in for what they believed would be the decisive blow. The situation had deteriorated beyond anyone's worst-case scenarios. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice. The 3 wounded soldiers needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided at an advanced facility, but the route to the alternate landing zone was now completely compromised. Enemy patrols had identified her evacuation path, and established ambush positions along the entire route. "Martinez, we can't get through," Sergeant Rodriguez reported grimly. "They've got the whole area covered. It's suicide to attempt another evacuation run." But Sarah looked at the 3 wounded soldiers lying before her and knew she couldn't abandon them. Chen's condition was rapidly deteriorating, and the other 2 casualties were showing signs of severe internal bleeding. Without immediate evacuation, all 3 would likely die within hours. "There has to be another way," she said, studying the tactical maps spread across the aid station table. The original evacuation route was indeed blocked, but perhaps there was an alternative path that enemy forces hadn't anticipated. Colonel Harrison, despite his own serious wounds, had remained at the base to coordinate the defense. His chest injury made movement difficult, but his tactical experience was invaluable in this crisis situation. "Martinez, there's an old mining road that runs along the western ridge. It's longer and more dangerous, but it might still be possible." Sarah examined the route carefully. The mining road was barely more than a goat path, winding through treacherous mountain terrain that would be extremely difficult to navigate while carrying wounded soldiers. The distance was nearly twice as long as her previous evacuation route, and it passed through several areas with no cover from enemy observation. "That route would take at least 6 hours round trip," Rodriguez pointed out, "and you'd be completely exposed for most of the journey. Plus, you'd have to carry 3 casualties instead of 1. And agreed with Rodriguez's assessment. The mission was beyond the capabilities of any single person, regardless of their training or determination. But as she looked at her wounded teammates, she remembered the promise she had made to herself months ago. She would never abandon her duty, no matter how dangerous the situation became. "I'm not leaving them," she said simply. "If there's a way to get them to safety, I'm going to find it." Over the next hour, Sarah developed the most ambitious rescue plan of her military career. She would modify her equipment to carry multiple casualties simultaneously, using a combination of specialized harnesses and improvised stretcher systems. The plan would require her to traverse nearly 6,000 meters of hostile territory while carrying wounded soldiers who collectively weighed more than 3 times her own body weight. The other soldiers watched in amazement as she prepared her equipment. Years of physical conditioning and technical training were finally coming together in a display of capability that few had thought possible. Sarah methodically checked every piece of gear, ensuring that nothing would fail during the critical mission ahead. "Martinez, this is insane," Chen whispered weakly as she prepared him for transport. "You can't carry all of us that distance. You'll collapse before you make it halfway." Sarah smiled reassuringly while checking his medical equipment one final time. "Chen, remember when you said my medical pack weighed more than I did? You were probably right. But I carried it anyway every single day because that's what the job required. This is just a bigger version of the same thing." As she spoke, enemy artillery began falling closer to the base perimeter. The final assault was beginning, and time was running out. If Sarah was going to attempt the evacuation, she needed to leave immediately while friendly forces could still provide some covering fire. Colonel Harrison approached her as she made final preparations. Despite his pain, he wanted to personally authorize what was essentially a suicide mission. "Martinez, I can't order you to do this. The odds of success are minimal, and you'd be risking your life for what might be an impossible task." "Sir, you're not ordering me to do anything," Sarah replied. "This is my choice. These soldiers trusted me to take care of them, and that's exactly what I intend to do." The colonel studied her face for a long moment, seeing the same determination that had impressed him during their first meeting. "In that case, you have my full support. We'll provide covering fire for as long as possible and maintain radio contact throughout your mission." The evacuation began during the heaviest fighting the base had experienced since the siege started. Enemy forces were launching coordinated attacks from multiple directions, trying to overwhelm the remaining defenders. Sarah used the chaos to her advantage, beginning her journey while enemy attention was focused on the main assault. Carrying 3 wounded soldiers required her to use an innovative transport system she had developed during her preparation. Chen, who was the most critically injured, was secured to a specialized backpack frame that distributed his weight across her entire torso. The other 2 casualties were attached to improvised stretchers that she pulled using modified climbing harnesses. The initial phase of the journey led through the base perimeter and into the rocky foothills beyond. Sarah had to move carefully to avoid detection while managing the complex logistics of transporting multiple casualties. Every step required careful calculation, as a single mistake could be fatal for all of them. "Contact rear," one of her patients suddenly whispered. Enemy soldiers had discovered their departure and were attempting to follow their trail. Sarah immediately changed direction, using her knowledge of the terrain to find concealment among the rocky outcroppings. The pursuing enemy patrol consisted of at least 6 soldiers, all of them fresh and unencumbered by wounded casualties. Sarah knew she couldn't outrun them while carrying her patients, so she would need to rely on stealth and misdirection to avoid capture. For the next 2 hours, she played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the enemy patrol. Using her knowledge of military tactics and her understanding of the local terrain, she managed to stay ahead of her pursuers while continuing to move her patients toward the evacuation site. The mountain path was even more treacherous than she had anticipated. Loose rocks and steep grades made every step dangerous, particularly while carrying such a heavy load. Sarah's legs burned with exhaustion, and her breathing became labored in the thin mountain air, but she maintained her pace, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed.
"Martinez, you need to rest," one of her patients urged as they reached a small plateau about halfway to their destination. "You're pushing yourself beyond human limits."
Sarah paused briefly to check their medical status and adjust her equipment, but she refused to take an extended break.
"We don't have time to rest. Your conditions are deteriorating, and the longer we stay out here, the more danger we're all in." As they continued their ascent, the weather began to deteriorate. Mountain storms in the region could develop rapidly, bringing dangerous lightning and flash floods. Sarah monitored the approaching clouds while calculating whether they could reach the evacuation site before conditions became impossible. The radio crackled with updates from the base, reporting that the defensive situation was becoming critical. Enemy forces had breached the perimeter in several locations, and ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. Sarah realized that even if she successfully evacuated her patients, there might not be a base to return to. "All units, this is command." Colonel Harrison's voice came through the radio. "We're preparing to implement final defensive measures. Medical evacuation flight is inbound to alternate landing zone. Estimated arrival in 90 minutes. 90 minutes. Sarah calculated the remaining distance and her current pace, realizing that she would need to increase her speed significantly to make the deadline. Her body was already operating beyond its normal limits, but somehow she found the strength to move faster. The final approach to the landing zone required crossing an exposed ridge that offered no concealment from enemy observation. Sarah could see hostile forces moving through the valley below, apparently searching for her evacuation route. She would need to time her movement perfectly to avoid detection. As she prepared for the final push, Chan's condition took a serious turn for the worse. His blood pressure was dropping rapidly, and he was showing signs of severe internal bleeding that her field treatment couldn't address. Without immediate surgery, he would not survive much longer. "Chen, stay with me," she urged while adjusting his medical equipment. "We're almost there. Just hold on a little bit longer." The crossing of the exposed ridge was the most dangerous part of the entire mission. Sarah moved as quickly as possible while remaining low to avoid enemy observation. The weight of her patients made maintaining balance extremely difficult on the narrow mountain path, but her determination never wavered. Enemy forces spotted them just as they reached the landing zone. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as hostile soldiers attempted to prevent the evacuation. Sarah immediately established a defensive position while calling for the medical helicopter to begin its approach. "Medevac flight, this is Martinez," she radioed. "Landing zone is hot. Repeat, landing zone is under fire. 3 critical casualties ready for immediate evacuation." The helicopter pilot's response was immediate and professional. "Roger, Martinez. Beginning approach under covering fire. Maintain your position." Friendly aircraft suddenly appeared overhead, providing close air support that forced enemy soldiers to take cover. The medical helicopter used this distraction to make its approach, landing just as Sarah reached the designated pickup point with her 3 patients. Loading the wounded soldiers onto the aircraft required every remaining ounce of Sarah's strength. Chen was barely conscious, and the other 2 casualties were in critical condition. But as the helicopter lifted off and headed toward the medical facility, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that her mission had been successful. The return journey to the base was a solo trip through increasingly dangerous territory. Enemy forces had identified her general location and were systematically searching the area. Sarah used every stealth technique she had learned to avoid detection while making her way back to her embattled unit. When she finally reached the base perimeter, she found a scene of devastation. The enemy assault had been repelled, but at tremendous cost. Several buildings had been destroyed, and casualty reports indicated that the unit had suffered significant losses. Colonel Harrison was waiting for her at the aid station, his own wounds treated but still serious. "Martinez, I don't know how you did it, but you've just accomplished something that will be remembered for decades. Those 3 soldiers are alive because of your courage and determination." Word of Sarah's heroic evacuation spread quickly through military channels. The story of the small medic, who had carried 3 wounded soldiers through 6,000 meters of enemy territory, became legendary within her unit and beyond. But for Sarah, the recognition was less important than the knowledge that she had kept her promise to bring her teammates home alive. In the weeks that followed, as the unit recovered from the siege and prepared for redeployment, the dynamics had completely changed. No one questioned Sarah's capabilities anymore, and her opinion was sought on everything from tactical planning to personnel decisions. She had proven that true strength came not from physical size, but from determination, skill, and an unwavering commitment to protecting others. The 3 soldiers she had evacuated all made full recoveries, returning to active duty with profound gratitude for their medics' heroic actions. Private Chen, in particular, became one of Sarah's strongest advocates, telling anyone who would listen about how she had saved his life against impossible odds. Years later, when military historians analyzed the siege of Camp Thunder, they would identify Sarah's evacuation missions as the turning point that preserved unit cohesion and morale during the darkest hours of the battle. Her refusal to abandon wounded soldiers, combined with her innovative approach to combat medicine, set new standards for battlefield medical care. But perhaps the most important legacy of Sarah's heroic actions was the lesson she taught about the true nature of courage. She had proven that being a hero wasn't about fitting someone else's expectations or meeting traditional standards of strength. It was about finding the determination to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The young woman who had arrived at Camp Thunder as an underestimated recruit had transformed into a legendary figure whose story would inspire future generations of military medics. She had shown that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who change everything, proving that courage comes in all sizes and that the strongest weapon on any battlefield is the human heart. Sarah Martinez had kept her promise. She had never abandoned her duty, no matter how dangerous the situation became. In doing so, she had not only saved the lives of her wounded teammates, but had also redefined what it meant to be a warrior in the modern military. Her legacy would live on in the countless lives saved by medics who followed her example, proving that true heroism knows no boundaries.